2 million men, moving as one. No nation had slowed them. No king had turned them back. No wall had ever held. The great king wasn't in the business of conquest. Not really. He absorbed nations the way a tide swallows a beach. Patient, certain, never once questioning the outcome before it arrived. This isn't the battle yet. It's a certainty, standing right before it breaks. A corridor cut from limestone, barely 15 meters across. Sea to one side, rock to the other. The Persian scout doesn't need instruments to know what he's looking at. One glance is enough. The figure he carries back isn't a distance. It's closer to a verdict. Later, a rider pulls up outside the royal tent, still catching his breath, groping for words that don't quite exist yet. Because in 3 continents of victories, the Persian army had never needed a vocabulary for this particular kind of news. 480 BC, the largest fighting force the ancient world would ever assemble is heading toward a scatter of mountain villages, too stubborn, almost comically so, to bend the knee. Not one person in Xerxes' camp expects this. To last past lunch, before any army exists, there has to be a story to hold it together. Persia's version was simple, and up until this point, it had never once been proven wrong. Resistance doesn't work. Facing the empire has one mathematically guaranteed outcome. It wasn't just talk either. Egypt had learned that. So had Babylon. So had Lydia. Every uprising crushed before it found its footing. What Xerxes took from his father wasn't only the throne. It was that same certainty, plus something heavier, an old score. Marathon had gone wrong once, and an empire built on never losing doesn't get to remember the one time it did. This wasn't a war of conquest then. Call it a correction and corrections. In a mind that's never had to second-guess itself, don't call for strategy, just patience. Years before a single Persian foot touched Greek soil, the empire had already been busy proving something, mostly to itself. At the Hellespont, engineers chained hundreds of vessels together into 2 floating bridges, wide enough to march cavalry across, long enough to make the strait itself look like an afterthought. A storm wrecked the first attempt. Xerxes treated that as an insult rather than an answer. The men responsible were put to death. The bridges went up again. Farther north, near Athos, where a Persian fleet had once been swallowed, rounding a nasty stretch of coastline, Xerxes tried something no ruler before him had bothered with. Not a detour, a canal, carved straight through the mountain. 3 years, thousands of hands, a channel wide enough for 2 warships to pass side by side, and an entire peninsula's worth of risk simply erased from the map. None of it was strategically necessary. The long way around would have worked fine. It was something else, a statement carved into the earth for anyone still unsure of what this king could force the world to do. For its era, Persian intelligence was remarkably good. Xerxes understood that Greece was fractured, city-states that couldn't stay allied more than a season. He knew Athens ruled the water, but had little to offer on land. He knew Sparta didn't even bother with walls. There was one thing no report could capture: what it actually feels like to stand across from a Spartan when there's nowhere left to run. That kind of knowledge doesn't survive translation onto a map. It lives only in the body of whoever has lived through it. And by the time word of it reached the Persian camp, it had stopped being intelligence altogether. It had become a warning nobody yet knew how to hear. Nothing about Leonidas' choice of Thermopylae was left to chance. Every inch of it was deliberate. 15 meters, at the narrowest stretch, cliff face on one side, water on the other. And in that stretch lay a contradiction no Persian commander had ever had to reckon with before. A 1,000,000-man army that can only throw 15 men at a time into a fight is functionally, in that moment, an army of 15. The very number that made Xerxes unstoppable everywhere else in the world worked against him here. Every fresh soldier who stepped into that gap wasn't adding muscle to the front line. He was only adding weight, pressing the men ahead of him into something that had made up its mind not to move. Calling the Immortals soldiers undersells them. They functioned more like an institution, a permanent fixture of dread, held always at 10,000 strong. Because the instant one man dropped, another filled the space. Before anyone even registered the gap, 3 continents of rebellions had gone down under them without ever mounting resistance that outlasted a season. What they ran into at Thermopylae wasn't a crowd of fighters. It was a piece of military engineering, refined over generations for precisely this kind of ground. Shields locked into each other, each one covering not just its owner, but the man standing beside him. Spears stretching 3 meters out, arriving well before any Persian blade could hope to close the distance. The first wave came around that curve in the pass, expecting an army. What met them instead breathed, calculated, punished every square meter of ground gained with a precision no individual act of bravery could outbid. Before things turned violent, Xerxes sent his spies ahead to size up the enemy. What came back rattled the court almost as badly as the fighting itself would. Here was the largest army the world had ever put together, and the Spartans, facing it down, weren't gearing up for a fight at all. A few trained quietly. Most just combed their hair. Slow, deliberate, almost like a ritual, as if the morning held nothing unusual. One of the Greeks in Persian service tried to explain it to the king. This is just what Spartans do before they fight. It wasn't carelessness Xerxes was staring at. It was something his entire empire, for all its reach, had simply never run into before. Men who'd already settled, with zero doubt left in them, exactly where their story would end, and who felt no need to be anything but calm about it. Fog rolled in off the coast. The morning the first day of fighting began, Persian doctrine was straightforward. Maybe a little too straightforward. Throw wave after wave of infantry forward. Drown the line in sheer numbers. Let volume finish the job. It always finished. In Egypt, in Lydia, in Babylon. Thermopylae, though, wasn't any of those places. It was a bottleneck. And inside it, the empire's tried and true formula flipped on itself for the first time in living memory. By evening, riders were bringing back reports. The scribes genuinely didn't know how to phrase. Persian military language had terms for a tactical pullback, for an orderly retreat. There was no term, though, for what was actually happening on the ground. A seasoned professional army whose gut reaction, before any officer said a word, was simply to get away as fast as legs would carry them further back. Officers who'd built entire careers on commanding through fear were now facing a problem fear alone couldn't solve. If any single decision exposed what Xerxes' power actually consisted of, It was this one. He had the men who'd pulled back, marched forward again, not to regroup them, but to force them. The Immortals and the Royal Guard took up position directly behind the infantry, under clear instructions. Nobody retreats without permission. In under a day, that narrow stone passage had pulled off something no campaign in the Empire's history had managed in years of fighting. It had taken the fighting spirit of the largest army on Earth and turned it into a problem that needed managing from the inside before it could even confront the enemy on the outside. Evening of the first day, light angled low through the pass, shadows stretching long across the stone, and Xerxes called his war council together. Rationally speaking, the numbers on that table made no sense at all. Persia held an advantage over the Greeks that no general in recorded history had ever actually needed to secure a win. Spartan casualties, according to every report coming in, were close to nothing. Persian losses ran the opposite direction. Not in raw totals. The empire could shrug off losses for days, weeks, months, without blinking, but in something far less replaceable. Confidence that the system as built actually worked. What really closed out that first day wasn't an inconclusive fight. It was the first crack, visible now, to everyone in that tent, running through the very story that held the empire together. That night, Xerxes didn't sleep the way a man does when he expects to win tomorrow. Attendants would later describe him pacing, calling for the same figures, again and again, as if asking twice might change the answer. 2 days in, and the Persian army hadn't gained a single meter inside that pass, but the terrain shielding Leonidas kept a secret the locals had always known, one nobody had bothered to share until now. A rough goat track called Anopaea, twisting up through the heights behind the Greek line. Sometime on the second night, a man from Trachis named Ephialtes slipped across into the Persian camp. He didn't show up with an army. He didn't bring a plan, just a path and a price for it. That was all it took. The flawless geometry that had spent 2 days humiliating an empire suddenly had a seam in it, one no formation of shields could patch from the inside. History wouldn't remember Ephialtes as any kind of warrior. It would remember him as something smaller and more uncomfortable to sit with. Proof that the biggest machines ever built rarely get broken by their toughest opponents. Usually, it's the smallest, most forgettable men showing up at exactly the wrong moment with exactly the right amount of greed. Xerxes wasted no time deciding. Hydrns got the call at midnight, along with an order that changed the whole shape of the campaign. Take 20,000 of the best troops. Follow Ephialtes up through the heights. Come down behind the Greeks at first light. None of those 20,000 had any idea 1,000 Phocian fighters were stationed on that exact path, put there for exactly this reason. Facing odds of 20 to 1, the Phocians pulled back to higher ground rather than hold the line. Hydrns never bothered engaging them. Why would he? The Phocians were never the point. Leonidas's rear was the point, and every step forward closed that distance a little more. Third day, dawn. Leonidas gathered his commandos. One last time. Retreat was put on the table, plainly, openly, For the Thespians, the Thebans, the Corinthians, the Phocians, everyone. Most took it. Leonidas didn't stop them. 300 Spartans and 700 Thespians made a different call. Not out of panic, not because the math had failed them. They stayed inside, a way of thinking. The Persian world simply had no framework for that certain ground matters more than the men standing on it. Leonidas had known. He wouldn't walk away from this. He'd known before he ever left Sparta. Surviving was never really the question. The real question was how much time 300 men could buy by bleeding the largest army on the planet, and what that borrowed time might be worth to everyone still marching south. The last stand up on the hill at Kolonos dragged on for hours. There was no way out, and both sides knew it. So the Spartans and Thespians fought like men who'd already spent tomorrow and had nothing left to protect. At this hour, Herodotus writes that when the spears snapped, swords came out. When swords stopped reaching, it was hands. When hands weren't enough anymore, teeth. Leonidas went down, somewhere in that final, collapsing stretch of fighting. What happened next mattered more than the moment itself. The Spartans refused to give up his body 4 separate times. They drove back Persian soldiers, trying to drag it away, killing 2 of Xerxes' own brothers in the process. Before the hill was finally lost, once the fighting stopped, Persian soldiers went through the piles of dead, looking for one particular body. They found Leonidas, torn up and broken, no different from any other corpse, scattered across that field. Custom across the ancient world, even between the bitterest enemies, called for a fallen commander's body to go home whole, given the dignity of proper burial. Xerxes threw that custom out entirely, still carrying the sting of that first day's humiliation. He had the body beheaded. The head went up on a stake, raised high enough for the whole army to see. It was supposed to read as total dominance. Instead, to Greek eyes, and to history since, it read as something closer to panic. A king who needed to mutilate a corpse just to feel like the win had actually landed. Thermopylae, on paper, was a Persian win. Nobody disputes that. The pass fell. The road opened up. Every ancient map would go on recording it as exactly what it looked like. A victory. But some victories cost more than they're worth in soldiers alone. What Xerxes actually spent was time. Troops he'd had to force forward at spear point. Messengers with no words for what they'd witnessed. A mutilated corpse that convinced nobody of anything. And all of it had spent the one thing holding his empire together across generations, the certainty that fighting Persia simply didn't work, mathematically, ever. That certainty had already died, quietly, inside a 15-meter stretch of limestone, long before Kolonos went silent. The army pushed south. Athens, already emptied out ahead of time, went up in flames. A victory that landed on nobody, since the people it was meant to punish were already watching from ships out at sea. At Salamis, in the same kind of narrow water, Themistocles picked, using Leonidas's exact logic, Persia's numbers turned against it again. The strait became a second Thermopylae, only this time on the water. And this time, final. Xerxes pulled the bulk of his forces back toward Asia, leaving Mardonius behind with whatever was left. A year on, at Plataea, that remaining force was wiped out on land. The same day, near Cape Michael, what little remained of the fleet went down with it. The empire that had never once known fear didn't learn it at Plataea. It didn't learn it at Salamis either. It learned it right here, inside a 15-meter stretch of limestone, in front of 300 men who took the time to comb their hair while waiting to die, and one king who had to mutilate a corpse because of victory he'd actually won still didn't feel like one. It didn't come from a defeat. It came from a victory that refused to feel like one.